Hey everybody, this is a little article called It's Their Fault by Sucrées. Sucrées is a international anti-nationalist group, according to one thing that I read, but I'm not an expert on who they are. Maybe if I click here, it'll tell me something interesting. Oh, here it is. There's actually a description. Sucrées. Sucrées is an anti-national leftist magazine that is being distributed for free in English-speaking countries. It focuses on providing undogmatic food for thought for a liberated society, one free of capitalism, sexism, homophobia, the state, racism, and other forms of domination. One that we, for lack of a better name, would call communism. Sucrées is the, quote, little sister, end quote, of the German youth magazine entitled Straßen aus Zucker, which has a circulation of 180,000 copies and has been in existence for nearly 5 years. The newly launched English version will begin with 30,000 copies distributed via info shops, autonomous centers, activist gatherings, as well as conferences and panel discussions. With it, we wish to further an international debate on how to bring about emancipation. Unlike a lot of leftist magazines, we try to break information down into a form that's easy to understand yet doesn't oversimplify. We are not affiliated with any party or large organization. We are dedicated to a volunteer-run collective of individuals and people from the undogmatic left communist group, TOP, Theory, Organization, Practice. Our project has provided an important platform for left debate in the German-speaking world. We hope to continue this with our comrades, friends, and allies from abroad. And it says here that Theory, Organization, Praxis is a Berlin-based anti-fascist, anti-capitalist group. They are the part of the Ganze Alliance, which consists of more than 10 groups from all over Germany and Austria. To get in touch with them, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read all that. But now you know who Sucrées is. Here's a little description of the article. It says, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest and most persistent prejudices. Whether openly and violently, or as a quiet opinion or attitude, it finds expression in everyday life, including anti-Semitic graffiti on the streets or synagogue walls, desecration of Jewish cemeteries, strange comparisons between Israel and Nazi Germany, and statements in politics and the media. That's the end of the description. Now we'll start the actual article, which again is called It's Their Fault. On school grounds, quote, you Jew, end quote, or variations thereof depending on the language can be heard as a swear word. In public debates, financial investors and bankers are attacked as a, quote, plague of locusts, end quote, an image reminiscent of biblical anti-Jewish stories. Even anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like those concerning the attack on the World Trade Center are popular. According to a global study by the Anti-Defamation League from 2014, $109 billion. No, that's not right. What is it? I don't know. It says, I think it says 1 billion. It says 1,09. I think that's supposed to be 1.09. Anyway, what do I know? People in the world today show anti-Semitic attitudes. And it says 1 billion. Yes, 1 billion people in the world today show anti-Semitic attitudes. In Western Europe, we are talking about 1/4 of the population. But this issue is not confined only to Europe. Anti-Semitism also exists in Arab countries and many other regions of the world. But what does anti-Semitism mean exactly? Anti-Semitism is the most common term for all forms of hostility against Jews. Historically, this hostility existed long before the advent of the term, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote. Jews have been perceived as a threat for a long time. Whether in ancient or medieval times, they have consistently been blamed for various perceived ills. Their very existence is seen as cause for religious, cultural, and social problems. Anti-Semitism, therefore, describes different degrees of mostly hostile attitudes against Jews. It operates with a variety of excluding prejudices and attributes that are ascribed to all Jews. You may have heard ideas of, quote, the Jews, end quote, as alleged parasites, as people assumed to be greedy and deceitful. But anti-Semitism not only stands for simple prejudices against Jews, but also for a specific explanation of the way the world is arranged. In this worldview, Jews are held responsible for all the bad things happening in the world. This characteristic distinguishes anti-Semitism from other forms of racism. Quote, foreigners, end quote, are usually described as lazy and inferior. Quote, the Jews, end quote, on the other hand, are described as influential and powerful. They are therefore not only bad and threatening, but also superior to others, and therefore hated. Where does all that come from? Already at the beginning of Christianity, a religiously motivated hatred against Jews arose. Anti-Judaism. It helped Christians set themselves apart from Judaism, a religion that basically came to be equated with evil. In the Christian Middle Ages, 5th to 15th century, this religiously motivated hatred spread further. It became accompanied by more and more anti-Judaic myths. Many stereotypes, for example, of the rich and avaricious Jew, are left over from these times. Approximately 200 years ago, with the beginning of the modern age, anti-Semitism changed significantly. Religious prejudices fused into economic, political, and cultural ones. This happened in a time of major social changes, upheavals, and transformations. Like the establishment of capitalism, were not understood by many people and brought fear with them. Therefore, simple explanations were welcome. Allegedly, quote, the Jews, end quote, were undermining the national culture, dominating politics. This happened in a time of major social changes, upheavals, and transformations, like the establishment of capitalism, were not understood by many people and brought fear with them. Therefore, simple explanations were welcome. Allegedly, quote, the Jews, end quote, were undermining the national culture, dominating politics, as well as ruling the economy. These attributes almost inevitably suggested that the, quote, Jews, end quote, were extraordinarily powerful, so powerful they could rule the world. At the same time, science was intensely involved in the construction of a, quote, Aryan race, end quote, and with it, racial anti-Semitism. Following the pseudo-scientific biologistic race ideology of the 19th century, Jews were not treated as a cultural or a religious denomination, but as a distinct, quote, race, end quote, with specific characteristics. In Nazi Germany, this racially motivated anti-Semitism led to the systematic mass murder of 6 million European Jews. How anti-Semitism shows up today? Quite simple, by taking up older anti-Semitic tropes and adjusting them to the international situation. Thus, new projections arise in debates around the Middle East conflict, the United States, or criticism of globalization and capitalism. Here, simplified explanations for current issues can sometimes tie in with anti-Semitism by once again putting the lion's share of the blame on the, quote, Jews, end quote. After 1945, a new form of anti-Semitism developed in Germany, which can solely be explained by the specific German situation. This so-called, quote, secondary anti-Semitism, end quote, described the post-Holocaust hostility against Jews springing from a rejection of memory and guilt. Not despite, but because of Auschwitz, resentment against Jews arise. The majority of Germans then and now avoid addressing the fact that they, their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents were involved in the mass murder of 6 million Jews. actively by looking the other way, by failing to resist. So they complain about how much longer must they atone and suffer, and how long their innocent grandchildren and great-grandchildren will have to pay for the Holocaust. They also harbor suspicions that Jews make a lot of money from the genocide with the help of the so-called, quote, Holocaust industry, end quote. Denial of guilt and responsibility, relativization of historical events, and the desire for a, quote, normal, end quote, way of relating to one's country are all part of this form of, quote, secondary anti-Semitism, end quote. Alternately, Auschwitz is a tale made up by the Jews. The bombing of Dresden is equated with the Holocaust, or Israel's policies get compared to Nazi Germany. A lot of Germans despise Jews because their presence seems to remind them of their own Nazi past. They would much rather close this darkest chapter of German history once and for all and make peace with the nation. They want to be, quote, normal, end quote, and happy nationalists again. And why and how it even exists among leftists. One point of reference for current anti-Semitism is the Middle East conflict, often under the guise of criticizing Israeli policy. These kinds of conversations sometimes are an open invitation to rally against the, quote, Jews, end quote, in general, especially because since after the Holocaust, open anti-Semitism is not really accepted anymore in public debates in a lot of European countries. Anti-Semitism, however, has never vanished. It therefore had to find new forms of expression. The new Jewish state founded after the Second World War provides a welcome projection screen. Certainly not every criticism of Israeli policy is anti-Semitic, but often the lines to anti-Semitism are crossed. It becomes suspect when people call into question the very existence and right to self-defense of a country, while at the same time they have no problem with all sorts of other countries and wars in the world. Or European Jews get asked what they think of, quote, their countries, end quote, policy, meaning Israel, always implying that they serve as some kind of representative of that stretch of land. In the German context, when Israelis are called Nazis and a, quote, Holocaust in Palestine, end quote, is discussed, this implies that the victims of the past have turned into today's perpetrators, doing exactly what has been done to them, all of which, of course, amounts to a crass relativization of the Nazi Holocaust, with the effect of making German guilt appear not quite as damning as it used to. Unfortunately, this form of anti-Semitism is also reflected in leftist circles. Some of these positions can be found in the pro-Palestinian movement. When, for example, the Palestinian struggle is inseparably associated with the struggle for peace, for human rights, and for the political right of self-determination of the Palestinians. There is no recognition that, for example, suicide bombings have nothing to do with emancipation, nor is it recognized that as a radical anti-Semitism exists in groups like Hamas or Hezbollah. If these groups prevailed, it would mean the death of 5 million Israeli Jews, but also gays, lesbians, feminists, transgender, or even just people who want to dance to loud music would have a hard time according to the ideas of Hamas, presumably as would the rest of the population. Strange organizations for left-wing solidarity, aren't they? Furthermore, anti-Semitic images sometimes appear in left debates revolving around a critique of globalization and associated critiques of capitalism. For example, when the negative consequences of globalization are seen as conspiracy of, quote, evil capitalists, end quote, or, quote, a clique of imperialist politicians, end quote, who are sometimes implied to be Jews or under Jewish control, or when even capitalism itself is not seen as a system that is inherently set up in a harmful way, a set of social relations under which people are forced to go to work not to meet social needs but to create profit, not because the particular employers are so greedy but because competition forces them to. Instead, capitalism is understood as the work of individual capitalists or corporations. A critique of capitalists not capitalism. In some cases, people only have something against capitalism when it is about interest rates or financial markets. They don't see that the financial sphere is closely related to the production of goods and that criticizing it alone doesn't make much sense, ignoring that the real evil lies in a mode of production in which people are exploited through wage labor. What does all of this have to do with anti-Semitism? As we have seen above, the equation of Jews with money was a pervasive image for centuries. It is firmly fixed in Western thought. Hence such a, quote, foreshortened critique of capitalism, end quote, nowadays provides a ready opportunity to make Jews responsible for the ills of capitalistic society. In this logic, it must always be a group of people who possess the features that for centuries were associated with the, quote, Jews, end quote. Being the so-called, quote, speculators, end quote, who cunningly, quote, drain the peoples dry, end quote, economically by claiming interest, and thus, quote, dominate the whole world, end quote. This line of argument then consciously or unconsciously builds upon anti-Semitic stereotypes. Interestingly enough, this, quote, abbreviated critique of capitalism, end quote, is also found among Nazi groups where it is rooted in their ethnic and nationalist ideas. To sum it up, anti-Semitism is not just crazy prejudice against Jews, but represents an even crazier form of false explanation of what is wrong in the world, according to the formula, quote, they are to blame, end quote. The reason and motivation for anti-Semitism are not always identical. Anti-Semitic images are often updated and adapted to the current world situation. Thus, they can be heard in discussions around the Middle East conflict, the United States, or the critique of globalization. And because leftists are also part of a society shaped by anti-Semitism, they are certainly not immune to such stereotypes. For all this is reason enough to develop a comprehensive and liberatory critique of capitalism, to understand the complex situation in the Middle East, and to be certain of the urgency of Primo Levi's realization that, quote, it happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. It can happen, and it can happen everywhere, end quote.